Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be running you through my top 10 favourite sci-fi and fantasy books of all time. This is as of the end of August 2023. I do tend to update this video every year or two. I expect to do this next year and probably the year after that. It's one of my favourite videos to film. I love to update my list as I read more and more amazing books, and this year is just like all the other years where I have found some gems that I've really loved and that I love to talk about on my channel. So before we jump into my top 10, I am going to do a few honourable mentions. The first honourable mention is going to be A City Dreaming by Daniel Polanski. This is an urban fantasy story set in New York, and we are following our main character as he goes through his magical adventures in New York. He's a bit of a mess. It's a fun time. There's a really amazing cast of secondary characters, and it's just a fun time. Like, if it's a no-brainer. It's one of these books that's good to read in between bigger fantasy series and bigger fantasy books. It's just an all-round good fun time. The next one is Watchmen by Alan Moore. This is a comic, and this comic really shifted my perception of how comics are a really interesting and fantastic medium to tell a story. I know that might sound really funny, but I've only really gotten into comics recently, so I haven't had tons of experience with comics and I was perhaps a little bit ignorant. But Watchmen is such a fantastic story about what happens when superheroes aren't really policed by anybody, and the question that does come up quite a lot is who polices the Watchmen, who polices the superheroes, and I just thought that was a really fascinating concept. I loved it, I devoured it in a few days, and there's a reason for that. The next one is The Mermaid's Tale by D.G. Valdron. This was definitely one of my favourite books of this year. Absolutely fantastic writing by Valdron. Very, very visceral, very dark, very gritty. It's just straight up really dark fantasy. It's not going to be for everybody, but my gosh, is it lyrical. My gosh, is it written so beautifully. And some of the character work, especially with the main characters, some of the best character work that I've read in a while. And it's just an all-round really, really good read. Next honourable mention, we have two left. The first one is An Autumn War by Daniel Abraham. This was my favourite one in the Long Price Quartet. This was actually on my top 10 list last year, but it's actually been bounced off this year, which is interesting. But I love that quartet, and I think An Autumn War is really kind of at the pinnacle of the story. There is a lot more kind of battle and war involved in that story, and I do really like that, especially not necessarily the battle itself, but all of the things that happen around a battle. And I just loved it for that reason. I also felt like a lot of the characters really reached the kind of height of their arc in that book. It was just really good. Definitely like a 5-star read, definitely one of my favourites still, but unfortunately didn't quite make it my top 10 this year. And then last but most certainly not least, we have Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This is probably my favourite Brandon Sanderson book, like full-length novel. I also really love The Emperor's Soul, but if I had to pick one full-length novel by Sanderson, it would be this one. It's absolutely fantastic. I love the magic system. I love that we have a sentient sword. I have a real soft spot for sentient weapons. I just think it's such a fun trope, especially when it's executed really well, and I think Sanderson did that in this book. It's just good. It's just a good time. Like, I really liked it. I didn't have to think too hard, but yet all of the POVs were really compelling, and it was just a really solid read. So that's the last one in terms of my honourable mentions, and now we're going to go into my top 10. All of these are extremely highly rated. These are all like 100 stars plus books for me, so any of these are a solid bet if you're looking for your next read. Just as a disclaimer, if I am referencing a series, I will say that I'm referencing a series, but I will pick the book that I most enjoyed in that series. So I am only picking single books rather than trilogies as a whole. And I haven't discriminated against having multiple authors on this list, though that being said, I don't think there are actually any repeat authors on this list this time. So there we have it. So let's get started. In 10th place, we have The Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. This is the second book in the David trilogy, and it's still to this day one of the best middle books I've ever read. It's just such a fantastic continuation of a series. Chakraborty just doesn't, I don't think middle book syndrome exists in her vocabulary, and you can definitely see that in the Kingdom of Copper. It's just such an amazing adventure-filled story, and it really takes it to the next level. We also get another POV in the second book, and I love that POV so much. One of my favourite characters of all time. And I just think the pacing really picks up. I also feel like her writing is a lot tighter in that book. The world building is amazing. We really get a sense of what Daevabad is like, the smells, the taste, the fashion, the architecture, everything just really works. And it's such a vivid story, and it feels like you could be there, even though it's obviously a fictional place. And I just loved it for that reason. So that whole trilogy is really solid, but I have to say I think Kingdom of Copper is just absolutely phenomenal as a continuation. In ninth place, we have The Winter Road by Adrian Selby. This has been in my top 10 list, I think the last 2 times I've done this video, and it's still in it. So that's pretty damn impressive. The Winter Road is essentially following the story of a woman who basically has to uncover something that has happened, and she kind of goes on this adventure, not really an adventure, but she kind of goes on this quest to kind of figure out what's been happening. And the magic system is really unique. It's almost kind of drug-powered magic system where they have to ingest things to activate their powers, which I really loved. I think I loved that as a trope as well. Like, it's not really done that often, and I've seen a few others try to do it, but nobody's done it quite as well as Selby. His character work is absolutely fantastic. His main character is still one of my favorite main characters of all time. She is still my favorite female character of all time, because she has strength, inner strength, physical strength, but most importantly, she has strength in terms of her own vulnerability and her ability to bring people together. And I've talked about this before. I think a lot of female characters in fantasy are presented as the strongest person in the room or in the world. And I just don't really like that. Like, I just don't think it's realistic. People often say, oh, of course it's not realistic, it's fantasy. Yeah, but you want the characters to feel grounded, at least in some sort of reality, so that you as a reader can relate to them. And I have to say, he did that with all of his characters in this book. The secondary cast of characters is fantastic as well. And I just think this is a really fantastic grimdark book for anybody who hasn't read it yet. So definitely go jump into that one. In 8th place, we have another one from last year, I believe, and that is The Curse of Chalion by Lois McMaster Bujold. Love this book. It's so good. It's so good. It's just fantastic. And the reason why it's fantastic is because Bujold's writing style is so accessible. It's almost quite poetic, but like not in a way that feels like it's been overly done and overly kind of exaggerated. It's just, it gets to the point, it tells the story in the way that it needs to tell the story, whilst not also sacrificing the quality of the writing, which I think is a really hard skill. Her character work is really fantastic. We follow, again, one of my favourite characters of all time, and he's your typical down on his luck warrior, kind of at the end of his career, kind of done with doing all the stuff that he's had to do, but he's so compelling because he's driven ultimately by a love for the people that he has around him, and that doesn't necessarily come through until the end of the book. And I love how he brings people together, and even though he's quite a morally grey character, he's very relatable, he's very grounded in reality, and he feels like somebody you could meet one day. He's definitely got shades of grey, but I would say that he's definitely a very good person, and so we're always rooting for him to succeed, which I think is always fun to read. Next, we have Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. I read this book in a few hours because of how hooked I was when I read this book. It was absolutely phenomenal, and it's one of those books that not only is it really well written, and the way that the story is told is just executed really well, the thematic work is just covered in a really sensitive way, and not in a preachy way where we feel like the author is trying to espouse her personal opinion. It's more that she is referencing actual events that have happened in history and making it accessible to sci-fi audience, which I think is really cool, and I wish we would see more of that in sci-fi and fantasy. I'm sure there is some out there that I'm just unaware of, but Butler is probably the first author where I've read that kind of covers really heavy historical thematic themes whilst also writing it in this kind of sci-fi fantasy context, not fantasy, more sci-fi context. The time travel was done really well. I've talked about this before briefly on my channel, that I think time jumps are really hard to do, and I think she did it exquisitely. Her character work is really strong. The plot work is really well paced. She just does everything really well, and I love it for that reason. Like, it's just a really solid read that you can get through in a couple of hours and devour it. Next, in 6th place, we have A Brightness Long Ago by Guy Gabriel Kay. This was also on my list last year, and I love everything about this book. This is a historical fantasy fiction book. It's definitely lighter on the fantasy side, but it's just a really fantastic book that centers around a bunch of characters who both interact with these two kind of rulers, political leaders, and it's about their interactions with those two people. We never actually get the POV of those two people, but it's really about how those two people impact and how their actions have consequences on everybody else involved, on the average person, on the everyday normal person. And I just think that's such a fascinating way to approach fantasy, because we don't really get that tons in fantasy. Normally we're focusing on our main character, not really other people. But in this, it's kind of flipped on the head, which I really liked. But that doesn't mean that the POVs are cast to the side. I think the character work is really, really, really strong. And I think Kay has a really good balance of plot and character. You'll often hear people say, I'm a more plot-driven reader, I'm a more character-driven reader. I am definitely a more character-driven reader, but I always like it when I find an author who's able to balance the two really well. And I definitely think Kay is one of those people. It's fantastic. It's very vivid. The world building is fantastic. The pacing is solid. Again, I read this one in a day. I actually read it when we had a heat wave in the UK, and it was the only thing that got me through that heat wave because I was so hooked. It was amazing. All right, we're down to the top 5. So in 5th place, we have Dune, Messiah by Frank Herbert. I read that this year. This is actually the first entry on this list of a book that I've read this year, which is interesting. But Dune Messiah is amazing. Dune, for me, is pretty overrated. Like, I think it was okay. I think the politics was okay. I think the character work was okay. I think the philosophical themes were okay. Dune Messiah, everything was amazing. It was an instant 5 stars. It's one of those books that I'm going to read again. It's almost like a treatise on society and politics and how to lead nations. Like, it's just such a fascinating insight into the mind of a ruler and the types of things that that ruler thinks about and how they try to rationalize the decisions that they make. And I just thought that was really, it's almost quite an intimate look into the way that our main character thinks. And I just think that Paul in this one, compared to the first book where I just thought he was a pretty average main character, I think in this one he really gets elevated into somebody that is almost on a different playing field at this point, because the way that he thinks about things compared to the first book is just so different, but yet it's still very in tune with the character that we do know and learn about in the first book, if that makes sense. But I feel like in Messiah, Paul is like next level compared to where he is in the first book. And it's interesting that this is the kind of second book in the series. I almost think of this as an extended epilogue because it's such a short book and it's such a like kind of natural continuation. Like, it could have easily been just a few more extra chapters at the end of the first book, but I'm kind of glad that it was split out because it made me look at it more like a philosophical text, which maybe wasn't intentional by Herbert, but it actually made me enjoy it more. And I think if you're somebody who likes really philosophical fantasy or sci-fi, then you'll love this one. Unfortunately, you do have to read the first book to get to the second one, but the first book isn't the worst book in the world. It's just that this one is exceptionally good, and the first one, it pales in comparison, in my opinion. All right, next place, we have The Folding Knife by KJ Parker. This has been on this list for a while. I think it was maybe number 2 or number 3 last year, so it has dropped a little bit, but it's still one of my favorites. It's still one of the best books I've ever read. It still lives rent-free in my head. Basso is still one of my favorite characters of all time. Again, it's just one of those books that just hits the notes in every single way. The narrative, the way that the character develops, the kind of events that happen throughout the book, the surrounding cast of characters, the world building, Everything about it is really interesting. We learn a lot about like mercantile banks, about business, about, again, kind of similar to Dune Messiah, like how societies are built and are run. And these are sorts of things that I love reading in my fiction, because I love reading that in my non-fiction. So when I get to see the things that I'm interested in my non-fiction creep into my fiction, you're onto a winner. And I think that's what KJ Parker does exceptionally well compared to most other authors, if not all other authors. And this book just brought together all of the things that I love in one book. This is another one that is very, very, very light on fantasy. I don't even think there's technically any fantasy at all, but it reads like a fantasy book. There are some kind of musings about kind of religious and spiritual beings, but again, I think it would be a stretch to call it a fantasy book, to be honest. But it does read like fantasy, and I think if you're a fantasy fan, you would definitely love this one. That being said, my only disclaimer with any KJ Parker book is that every single book covers specific themes, and this one, you learn a lot about banking, as an example. So if you're not interested in old banking systems, then you're probably not going to like it. But if you even have like a remote interest, you might find it really interesting. All right, we're down to the top 3. So in third place, I think this is probably going to shock quite a few people, we have Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. This is the second book in the First Law trilogy, and I love this book. It is without doubt the best book out of all of Abercrombie's books. I still love all of his other books, and most of them are all still 5 stars. But this one for me is just absolutely phenomenal. I don't typically like quest tropes, which is exactly what this second book is about. It's just literally the kind of a main group of characters going on a quest. But he subverts so many of the typical things that are a part of the quest trope. And that's why I loved it so much. I also just love all of his characters, the ragtag group of people that he puts together. The character work is fantastic. Logan Nine Fingers is still to this day one of my favourite characters of all time. And it's just a fun time. Like you can almost always be sure that Abercrombie is going to write something compelling, regardless of what it is. And I think Before They Are Hanged is where we really see the height of that. We see it in other books as well later on in his series, but I think Before They Are Hanged is what really solidified him in my mind as an absolutely incredible author. And it will always just have a really soft spot in my heart, because I remember reading Before They Are Hanged during the pandemic, and it just transported me to another time. And I just love everything about it. Like, it's flawless in my opinion. All right, down to the top 2. In second place, I've actually put 2 books together by the same author in this one because I can't pick. I just can't. So we're going to just mush them together. I'm kind of cheating, but it's fine in this case. So we've got The Warrior Prophet and The Judging Eye by R. Scott Bakker. The Warrior Prophet is the second book in the Prince of Nothing trilogy, and then The Judging Eye is the first book in the Second Apocalypse, which is book 4 overall in the totality of the series, which is 7 books in total. The Warrior Prophet, let's start there. Similar to Before They Are Hanged, this is the one that I read, and I realised in that moment after I finished it, and even just as I was reading it, that Bakker is above most fantasy authors. And his writing is just on another level. Like, it's exquisite. Everything from his world building, his pacing, just the way that he writes extremely lyrically, but not in a way that feels like overly pedantic and overly strenuous on the brain. It's very philosophical. It's very, very multi-layered. It's the sort of story that you read and you're thinking to yourself, what am I reading? What does this mean? What consequence is this going to have later on in the book? And we don't necessarily know. We don't necessarily find out until the end of the last book, but the payoff is so worth it. And going on that journey of trying to figure that out alongside the characters is just such a rewarding journey, even though we don't necessarily always get the answers that we want. The character work is incredible. Akamian, Esmenet, Nair, one of my favourite characters of all time, Mimara, so many amazing characters and covering so many different themes. Really, I'm talking about both books now. Both books are so grand in scale. This whole series is so grand in scale, and yet it feels so grounded in reality because every single one of the characters even though they're very morally grey and some of them are just straight up evil, you can relate to their struggle in some way, shape or form, even if you don't necessarily relate to them as a person, which I actually did with quite a few characters. So I thought that was really interesting. The Judging Eye for me was the one that I read in like 3 days, which if you watch any of my Bakker videos, the way that I structured my reading of Bakker was that I was going to take it really slow because his writing is quite dense. And I didn't want to read more than a chapter a day. And his chapters are quite long as well, to be fair. So I didn't want to kind of overdo it. I wanted to take my time. But The Judging Eye, from the moment that I started that book, it was just like bang, 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 bang. And I just read it within 2-3 days. I was just so hooked. Like, it was just perfect. It was perfect. They were both perfect, but in different ways. I think The Warrior Prophet was perfect because of the way that he juggled the politics with the battle scenes, and then the like incredible character details that we got. And then I think with The Judging Eye, the pacing in that book was just absolutely perfect. Like, every single moment there was something happening. We also got introduced to one of my new favorite characters of all time that I'll talk about in a future video, but one of the most twisted, sick characters I've ever read. And yeah, I was kind of here for it. It was just amazing, absolutely amazing. And Bakker, without a doubt, is one of my favourite authors of all time now. And that leads us with first place. I wonder if anybody's guessed it, because this is probably going to be a shock to a lot of people. Firstly, because it's a sci-fi book, and I never ever thought I would have a sci-fi book at the top of this list. And secondly, it's also a book that I read this year, and I did rave a lot about it, but I think maybe it flew under the radar for quite a few people when I posted my review. And that is Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. This book is a book that I still think about. I read it earlier on this year. I still think about Charlie. No joke, I still think about Charlie. It is such an amazing book about intelligence, about humanity, about consciousness. It talks about language and communication, how we share ideas. Like, again, another thing that I love reading about in my non-fiction. So it was just the kind of perfect storm of a compelling main character in Charlie who goes through this insane emotional and mental shift. Seeing him go through that journey and feeling the loss of innocence that he goes through, which was just so heartbreaking and just honestly sometimes quite tough to read. And yet it was still a fantastic illustration of all of the different themes that Keyes is covering in this book. But I do think it really kind of centers around a few core themes, one of which is what is intelligence. Like, I think it's just so amazing. It's one of those books that I know I will read again, and I know I will take away things from it that I didn't take away on my first read. It was another book that I read in less than a day. Most of these books I actually read like very quickly because I love them all for one reason or another. But this one I read within like 2-3 hours because I was just so hooked and I needed to know what happened to Charlie. And not gonna lie, kind of wish I didn't know now. But it's just amazing. Like, it's so good. This book will make you think. Most of these books will to some extent. But I think out of all of them, this one will make you think the most because it's just such an amazing like study on human nature. And I love that stuff, as you all know. So there we have it. Those are my top 10 sci-fi and fantasy books of all time. We had a pretty good mix this time. A few new entries and then also a mixture of sci-fi and fantasy, which hasn't really happened that often. So yeah, if you have any recommendations based on my favourites, let me know down below. And I'd be really curious to hear, like, what are your top 3, top 4 favourite books of all time, specifically as it relates to sci-fi and fantasy. I will be doing another list of all my top non-SFF books of all time, so keep an eye out for that, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye.